Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today for this edition of Framing the Future, a show in which we talk about the issues which we believe will frame the future of forestry in Maryland. It's our pleasure today to have a unique guest with us, which we'll introduce in just a moment. Let me remind all of you that the show is being recorded and that it will be available on marylandforestryboards.org in about a week. We're very pleased that these shows are all up to date. All past shows are on our thing. It's my pleasure today to introduce our moderator for these sessions, a former Mel Fellow. We've just had a new group of Mel Fellows join us this week for the 24-25 academic year. Megan was one of our first Mel Fellows. Megan Carr is a urban forester in the city of Baltimore and the moderator of Framing the Future. Megan, share with us the guest today, okay?
All right, thank you, Gary. Yeah, welcome everyone. We're really looking forward to this discussion. Just a few comments before we jump in for housekeeping notes. We welcome your questions for our speaker. To enter those, there is a Q&A function. It should be at the bottom of your screen. We will be saving those questions for the end of the session, but do feel free to enter them at any time. This session is recorded, so if you miss a part of today's session or would like to go back and view any of our previous webinars, please go over to marylandforestryfoundation.org and click on webinar. If you were forwarded an invitation to this series and aren't on our mailing list yet, you can also join our mailing list over there. And without further ado, we will jump on into a really important discussion and one that we've been looking forward to for some time. Today, we're joined by Joan Maloof. Joan Maloof is the author of numerous research articles in 5 books. Those are Nature's Temples, Treepedia, The Living Forest, Among the Ancients, and Teaching the Trees. In addition to her research and writing, Maloof founded an organization with the goal of creating a network of protected forests across the U.S. That organization, the Old Growth Forest Network, now has hundreds of volunteers and thousands of supporters. Maloof works to educate others regarding the extent and condition of our forests and to encourage their protection. Her formal education includes a bachelor's degree in plant science, a master's degree in environmental science, and a doctorate in ecology. She is a professor emeritus at Salisbury University, where she taught biological science and environmental studies. So welcome, Dr. Maloof. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks. Should I just jump right in?
Please do.
I appreciate this invitation today, everyone. So here we go. I'm a botanist, really. I love plants, very interested in plants, always have been studying them for a long time. For a while, for the Heritage Program, DNR, I was identifying rare plant species on the eastern shore of Maryland. But at one point, I became very interested in what was happening with the forests around me. And that encouraged me to write a book called Teaching the Trees, which is filled with natural history stories about all the organisms that are connected to the trees in the forests and how those trees are habitat and food for those other organisms. And in that book, I had a chapter called Old Growth Air, where I visited the closest old growth forest to my home. And that forest ended up being Schoolhouse Woods on Wye Island. We'll talk about that a little bit more today later in the presentation. But I wrote about visiting that forest and what that was like for me to experience an old growth forest in my landscape. And when that book came out, so many people wanted to know where that forest was. And I realized that there's this interest that folks have to experience a forest that hasn't been cut or blown over or otherwise majorly disturbed. And that led me to writing another book called Among the Ancients that you see here, which describes one old growth forest in each of the 26 eastern states. So it took me a few years visiting these old growth forests, and on those journeys, I learned the true story of our nation's old growth forest, that in 1620, let's say when the European settlers were first coming to the area, all that area in black there was forested, and there were certainly native people there, and they were certainly using wood and clearing some wood, but estimates are that at least 60% of that forest you see there in black is what we would today call an old growth forest. You know, there were disturbances, as I said, natural disturbances and some clearings, but the majority of it was old growth forest. But with the European settlers came the real active clearing of forests. And a lot of that timber was exported to other countries because they'd already cleared their old forests. And a lot of it was used right in America. By then it had been become the United States of America for every reason, you know, for building homes, for building ships, for building railroads. There were no plastics then, so everything, wood was used for everything. But by 1920, that map on the right, we had really cleared much of the original old growth forests. And at this point, then the clearing spread into the west with the western expansion, and we started clearing the redwood forests. And in fact, we cleared 98% of them, 2% left. So this map that shows virgin area of virgin forest today, of course, we don't call it virgin forest anymore. That's, you know, an unpopular term, seemed patriarchal or something. We call them original forest or primary forest or old growth forest. And the estimates are that there is only 1% left in the east and 5% left in the west. And of course, those western old growth forests look very different than the eastern old growth forests. So in the west here, I'm hugging a big old redwood tree, and this is an old growth redwood tree, so it could be 1,000 years old. And in the eastern old growth there, I'm hugging a chestnut oak that's 350 years old. So you might have a tree that large in your yard, so you might not think that if you saw a forest with trees that size, that it would be an old growth forest. So you have to, that's one of the problems. People in the East think, oh, when you walk into an old growth forest, you'll automatically know that it's an old growth forest because it'll remind you of Muir Woods or something. Well, that's not the truth. The signs are more subtle than that. So can't always tell by size. So with realizing forest development process is what I'd like to talk about next, and how a forest gets to be an old growth forest. Well, you know, as we know, anything can happen to a forest. It can be burned down by an intense fire. It can be knocked down by a tornado. An ice storm can get to it. It can be clear cut, and then the forest starts all over. So those things I'm describing would be the stand initiating disturbance. So the forest is cleared out, but if you leave any piece of land alone here in Maryland, it is eventually going to turn into a forest, unless it's one of our rare rock outcroppings or it's just too wet, like a swamp or a bog or something. So what's going to happen here is we're going to have weeds, and then we're going to have little trees will come in. It could be cherries, it could be pines. And those trees that come in after that cut or disturbance, they're all competing with each other for the light. And they're going to grow up together in what we call dog hair, way too thick. You're not going to have much life underneath those trees because the shade is going to be so dense, even the herbaceous plants can't live. But those trees are competing with themselves, and the weaker of the trees will die out. And this is the stem exclusion phase. And as those weaker trees die out, we're going to get other trees that will start growing in underneath, including some of the shade tolerant trees, like the maples and beeches will come in under there. And then if that process continues long enough, we'll get to the old growth stage, which has every type of species in the canopy, the shade loving, the sun loving, and a lot of coarse woody debris on the forest floor. So this is what our old growth structure looks like. This is another illustration of kind of the same thing, the disturbance, the stand initiation, stem exclusion, which maybe go from 20 years to 80 years, and then the canopy transition between 80, let's say 80 to 100, 80 to 150 years old, and then over that, the old growth phase. Now here, I like this graph a little bit more because they're showing that the other thing that happens in the old growth phase is you will get gaps. And that is because these trees can get so large and they can form such large canopies that they're taking over a lot of the space in the canopy and light. And when those trees eventually die, maybe after a few hundred years, they're going to fall over, they're going to take a couple other trees with them, and what you're going to have there is a gap where the sunlight can get to the forest floor, and that's important for the biodiversity in the forest because then that sunlight is early successional habitat there, and it provides light for the herbaceous plants and all the other things that need some sunlight. Now, I'm going to talk about the state of Maryland and our old growth forests. So the state of Maryland DNR actually did an old growth forest inventory. And this was funded in 2002 with federal money that was received, you can read it here, from the government to conduct an inventory of old growth forests in the state of Maryland. And it was Heritage Program, Forest Service, a number of people were on that commission to study the old growth forest. And they had to come up first with a definition for old growth forest for Maryland before they did the inventory. So I'm going to have a few slides here describing the definition the state of Maryland has for old growth forests. Okay. Number one, an old growth forest is a minimum of 5 acres in size with a preponderance of old trees, of which the oldest trees exceed at least half of the projected maximum attainable age for that species. Right, so it's a little bit complex already, you know, preponderance of old trees, what's an old tree, exceeds half the maximum attainable age. So then in that DNR old growth inventory, they have these tables that have the maximum expected lifespan of a tree. So for instance, for tulip poplar or yellow poplar, Liriodendron tulipifera, the maximum lifespan we're thinking here is about 250 years old. So half of the maximum attainable age is 125 years old. So if you have a preponderance of tulip poplar trees in the forest that are 125 years old, that would be considered an old growth forest. Another example down here, the loblolly pine, Pinus taeta, maximum lifespan estimated to be 250 years old. And again, maximum half of that is 125 years old. So you have a forest with tulip poplars, pines, probably oaks, different things that are over 125 years old. That could be considered one of the signs for an old growth forest. Then the other number 2 is shade tolerant species are present in all age size classes. So I just pulled out beech tree here as one example because it's shade tolerant. So this means not just that shade tolerant, that beech trees are in the understory, for example, but they would also be in the canopy. They've had enough time to come in and reach that size. And this is a beech tree in a forest on the eastern shore. This beech tree is actually on the grounds of Longwood Gardens in a forest, an old growth forest. Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania, as you know. So that's what a old growth forest beech tree might look like. Okay, number 3 in the definition, there's an accumulation of dead wood of varying sizes and stages of decomposition. So standing dead wood, these would be the snags, and downed dead wood, accompanied by decadence in live dominant trees. So not just small dead trees that are thinning themselves out, but even some of the largest canopy trees might have died or might have fallen over. And I know, if you're a forester and you're trying to get income from these forests, it's hard to see the big old trees die, whether standing or falling over. But from an ecological standpoint, they're very important, and they're also indicative that that forest has been left alone for a long time and it's an old growth forest. Okay, and these are just some examples from other places. This is an old growth forest in the Smoky Mountains, and this is actually an American chestnut tree that I'm standing next to, a log, a down coarse woody debris. And so those chestnut trees, although they died from the blight, they fell over, but they are still decomposing. They're still part of the ecology of that forest, supporting, you can see here the mosses, but also a lot of fungi, a lot of insects, a lot of other animals like lizards and salamanders and snakes are living there. And this top right one, that's from Swallow Falls, which is one of the old growth forests in Maryland. Okay, the next part of the definition, a high degree of structural diversity characterized by multiple growth layers, understory trees, shrubs, herbaceous ground layers. So this is not your forest that's in the transition where all the trees are the same height and they're competing with each other. No, this forest has many layers, just as it says here. You'll find understory trees, you'll find shrubs, you'll find canopy trees. And it's really this structure is one of the things that makes the forest very important habitat, especially for birds, this multi-layered structure. Oh, I didn't realize that was a video. Okay, that was a private forest I'll talk about in a bit. The same one in this photo here. Okay, we're still in the definition. Pit and mound topography can be observed. You all know what that is, I'm sure. When you have a tree fall over, the windfall, it creates this pit where the roots have pulled dirt out of the ground, and then the roots have this soil with it that creates a mound. And even as that tree decomposes, that mound of soil will be left behind, and so will the pit. So you'll have topographic interest on the ground that also increases biodiversity, because some things live better in the low areas and some things live better and do better on the higher areas. And so the pit and mound topography is a result of these trees getting very large, perhaps blowing over in a windstorm, and means that they weren't cut when they were young. They got big, they got old, and then they fell over. The other part of the definition is randomly distributed canopy gaps. This goes back to what I was explaining in the beginning. So it's the old growth forests are not all dense shade. You're going to have spots of sunlight where the sun-loving tree species, the oaks and the pines and the hickories, can come back in. And so we're not transitioning to just a shade tolerant group of trees. You'll have all the species that will be there if that forest was left alone long enough. Okay, so that was the definition they used, and then they did a survey. And this is what they came up with. These might be hard to read for you, the names, but where you see this writing, these are the old growth forests in Maryland. And most of them are in Western Maryland, and primarily because that's where the rocks are and that's where the hills are. And it has been harder to clear those forests than it has been in other parts of the state. Now, on the Eastern Shore, there is only 2 old growth forests on state-owned land. And that is Schoolhouse Woods that I mentioned earlier, right here, a total of 19 acres, and Cottingham Mill Run, a total of 5 acres, which is in Pocomoke State Forest. And it has no trails, it has no parking area. It's not really a place that's easy to visit, although I've been there. So DNR owns almost 500,000 acres, 446,000. 2,300 is old growth forest. That's 0.5% of state lands. And on the Eastern Shore, there's 172,500 acres owned, and 19 acres is old growth forest. That's 0.01%. So from my eyes, I think we should have a little bit more than that. And we can't just make old growth forest overnight. So what we need to do is identify older forests that we want to allow to become old growth again. And I'm not saying don't cut any forests, but identify some older forests to let them mature, because as you know, anything could happen to these 2 forests here that we have. So we need to have something backup for a number of reasons. One, so that people can see what these old growth forests look like on the shore. They're very curious. I find them to be beautiful, and also because they're special habitat for a lot of species. Okay, so Schoolhouse Woods that I mentioned. Now, those old growth forests that are owned and managed by DNR, if that forest is in a Maryland state forest that gets certified by FSC, then those forests are protected from cutting, because the FSC says that old growth forests can't be cut. So that means that 5 acres, Cottingham Mill Run, is protected. But the forests in parks don't have that same protection automatically. So Schoolhouse Woods is managed by the park department. And so it was not protected. In order to get this forest protected from cutting, we actually had to introduce a bill in the House that said any old growth forest owned by the state of Maryland can't be cut. And that passed in 2022 by a wide majority. So those forests that you saw in the 2007 survey are already protected, happy to say. So why are they protected? Why are they important? They can serve as controls for management, you know, that all the things we do to the forest. Well, what would happen if we didn't do anything? This would show us. And there are unique historic databases to show what our forests were like and provide genetic diversity. And by incorporating stands that are approaching this old growth definition, we would help ensure the biological diversity of Maryland's forests. Okay, so we have no national forests here in Maryland. We just have state forests. So how we manage our state forests can be very important. And I know that the state forests are managed for multiple reasons, including they're very economically important on the shore. And we have a very active timber industry that hopefully will stay alive. But at the same time, I try to be a voice for balance. So this particular forest here was a forest, that's one of my students, and he's standing on the stump of a white oak tree. So this was one of those mixed, very diverse, close to 100-year-old forests on a recreational trail that I thought would be better as one that we kept for perhaps a future old growth forest. And when you get into the forest management plans. Now I live on the Eastern Shore in Berlin, and so I'm mostly interested and mostly just have time to look at what's happening with our Eastern region state forests. So those are our Chesapeake State Forest and our Pocomoke State Forest. So that's where this data is coming from. And if you look at the structural stage, you'll see that most of it is loblolly pine between 16 and 50 years old. And as you get into the older forests, very small amounts of it exist, or the uneven aged forest. And for instance, in the mixed pine hardwood, there's only 187 acres of that left in the uneven age category. So right now, the 2025 annual work plan is out, and I go over a draft of that, and I see that there is silvicultural prescription for 1,770 acres, and much of it is of this younger forest that they are thinning or cutting out, regeneration harvest. And those harvests, I just skip right over. I say, okay, this is part of our industrial forest on the shore. But then when I see part of this rare 187 acres that's going to be cut, I feel like it's my job to go see what it looks like. So I go see what it looks like. So this is this spring. One of these harvests was set to take place on something called the Blue Bike Trail. So I went out there, gorgeous mountain laurels in bloom, recreational trail. It's also a handicapped hunter's trail. And I just walking up it's only 45 acres, the harvest is supposed to be. And yes, it was going to be group selection. So some of these trees would be left behind, but I feel like that the damage to this forest is just not worth it. It's only 45 acres. Like I said, there's 1,770 acres on the plan. So can we set this beautiful recreational trail aside and have this become perhaps one of our old growth forests in the future? I counted 18 different tree species just walking up this trail through the center of the 45 acres, not even going off of it. So there's like willow oaks, and there's black gums, and there's some of the tallest sassafras that I've ever seen. And there's American beech, and there's a lot of southern red oak, and there's white oak. And yes, there's big, beautiful loblolly pine. And that's probably why they want to cut it. And it's about 100 years old. But as we saw, some of those pines can live to be 200 years old. Wouldn't that be amazing to see? So I do advocate for leaving some of our state forests to develop to become old growth forest. So this was one of these older forests too that from last year that I said, I didn't think should be cut. And it's FSC certified. It is. These are the auditors checking it over, and the reasons given are health restoration, regeneration, sustainability, resiliency. But when I walked through this, which I wrote in my comments that I didn't think should be cut, to me, it just doesn't feel like I want all of my older state forests to feel. I'll put it that way. And I know some of you feel differently. So why are old growth forests important? Often I would hear that forests had to be managed to be healthy. And so I was interested in this as a scientist, and I really dug into the scientific literature to write my book called Nature's Temples, A Natural History of Old Growth Forests. So I went into the scientific papers, and no matter what that scientist studied, if they were comparing managed younger forests to old growth forests, I was looking at what they found. And what they found was that the unmanaged older forest, and I just have to say these are loose definitions, because the managed were all ages, could have been, anything up to 60 years old or 90 years old. And then the unmanaged could have been starting at 120, could have gone up to 300-year-old forests. So there's a lot of looseness there where I talk about managed and unmanaged, young and old. But in general, they found higher carbon storage in the older forests. They found more salamanders, both numbers and species, more lichens, numbers and species, beetles, numbers and species, more fungi species, more snail species, more herbaceous plants. Birds, it was mixed. Maybe about the same number of species in young or old, but different species. Some species need the older forests, some species need the younger forests. So in general, if you take a look at that book, you'll see that there's a lot of species that if we didn't have any of these older forests, we would lose those species. And it's because of those things that I described in the definition. It's because of the standing snags and the coarse woody debris and the structural difference in the canopy, all different reasons for these organisms to be more common in the older forests. So there's a lot of, we try to do a lot of education. This is one of our newest publications where we let people know that they have choices in how their forests are managed. If they want the maximum income from their forest, they're going to behave a whole lot differently than if they wanted the most salamanders, perhaps, or the most beauty. And we recognize that there are choices to be made. So some of these choices are, how do I put this? They almost feel like fads. 20 years ago, we hadn't heard anything about Young Forest Initiative, and there wasn't really this push for early successional habitat. Now, all of a sudden, there seems to be this push for early successional habitat or Young Forest Initiative. And it's kind of fascinating when you get into these things and you think, well, how did this start up? Where did this even come from? Well, where it came from really was the hunting groups. And they wanted to make sure that they had enough quail and enough grouse and enough woodcock. And these are species that can prefer some cleared areas. And so they actually hired a public relations firm and said, how can we make this clearing more palatable to people so that they won't argue with it? And so that's where they came up with the term Young Forest Initiative. And they've been promoting that and saying things like early successional habitat is currently underrepresented. But as a scientist, I'm saying, well, is this really true? Like, do we just take this PR firm's word for it? Or do we actually look at the amount of early successional habitat that we have? And is this a problem? Now, I have nothing against early successional habitat. I know that it's really important for biodiversity as much as the old growth forest habitat is. But cutting the forest to create early successional habitat, is this a good thing? Well, I worked with some other very respected biologists, ecologists, forestry people to look at this question. And what we learned was that the amount of early successional habitat, what did it used to be? What is it now? What should it be? Is an interesting question. Well, if you look back in those old growth forest maps that I showed you way back before we started forest clearing, it's estimated that there was about between 1 and 2% early successional habitat in the eastern regions that we studied. And that would have been from these things like the fires and the tornadoes and the ice storms and the humans on the landscape. So early success and the gaps in the old growth forests. That's another really important. So there was more early successional habitat within the forest in those gaps. But then with the forest clearing, that early successional, where there was lots of early successional habitat, right? So between like 1880 and 1920, way more early successional habitat than we have now, because there were lots of clear cuts everywhere, and then there were lots of fires from that slash. And then as the forest started to recover, let's say now we're into the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s, that early successional habitat started disappearing again. And so those species that came in to take advantage of the early successional habitat then started shrinking again. So right now, the estimate is, at least in the Maryland Eastern region, that there's about 4%. And the majority of that is on the big power lines or the areas that are too wet to support forest growth. So I believe that that's the best place if we're really concerned about early successional habitat. It should be either in those places like under the broad power lines or in places where we're letting forests recover. So we have some golf courses around here, for instance, that the DNR has just acquired. Fabulous. They're going to let them go back into forest. Fabulous. Well, that's perfect early successional habitat there. We don't need to be cutting older forests to create early successional habitat. Now, this cut is not in Maryland. This cut is in New Jersey. And this was in a intact wildlife management area in New Jersey. A lot of these oaks were 120 years old, and they cut this with the excuse to create early successional habitat for the yellow-rumped warbler, which for many reasons is probably not going to come in there anyway. So I find this to be disingenuous. Like maybe they wanted to cut that for the income or other reasons. That's whatever. Just say that. Don't say it's for early successional habitat. These are some of the trees from that cut, those oaks. And if you're familiar with the ecologist Doug Tallamy, he's at University of Delaware. He points out how important oaks are for birds and so many caterpillars from butterflies. And that's why they're really important for the birds, because those birds are feeding off of those caterpillars, especially during nesting time. So it's sad to see these 120-year-old oaks be cut for early successional habitat. Okay, so I'm not just interested in the state forests. Also, we speak out for other public forests, such as this one, Gwynns Falls Leakin Park in Baltimore. Amazing to have this size forest in one of our biggest cities. It's over 1,000 acres. I was very impressed when I was in there. A lot of almost old growth or old growth habitat in there, but it is not protected from cutting. So we are trying to do what we can. I say we, the Old Growth Forest Network and Friends of Leakin Park, to get some protections for that forest. And I know the state is getting involved in managing it as a park now, but we still want to see those protections for that forest, because without protections there, it's owned by Baltimore City. Anything can happen, and almost did. A highway almost went through there and was stopped in the Mikulski administration. And most recently, it did have a huge swath of forest cut out, 2.2 miles long, 700 trees removed for the replacement of a gas pipeline. So I believe this forest needs more protections. This is what that swath looks like going through Gwynns Falls Leakin Park. And these are some of the trees that came out of that, big old trees in the middle of a urban park, very important. Private forests, the majority of our forests are private forests. I know there's not much say I can have in what somebody does with their private forest, but I would say we have no idea how much old growth is left in our private forest. Could be a lot, could be none. I don't see a lot of it. I would just say that for these, I was called in to look at this forest that had already been marked for cutting. It had all the attributes of old growth forest to me. Tulip poplars, 125 years old, big old pines, over 100, big old beech, big old oaks. And it had a stream through it. This could have made a beautiful park if the owners wanted to sell it. But what happens is the mill company gets a call, the timber cruiser cruises it, and then it goes down without anybody ever seeing it, because there's no way for private citizens that aren't owners of this forest to have any say. And a lot of times the owners don't even know what they have here. They don't even know that it's special. So I would just make a plea and say, timber cruisers, if you see something really special, maybe let the people know. And maybe if they knew how special it is, they would want to sell it for park, or at least have somebody. In this case, we offered to buy out the value of the timber, but the owner wasn't interested. And this is the last time I saw it. This is what was happening, and I honestly couldn't go back again. The owner never even saw the forest. It was, just bought it and sold it just like that. And this timber was I asked, it was going to become caskets, and it was going to become construction mats. So with the cranes go on, so they can build things without sinking in the mud. And call me a romantic, but I think our last old growth forests can go for better things than that, even if they're privately owned. My conclusion slide. And thank you, Gary, in the beginning, you said, let's work together. We're not trying to say, don't cut forests, or that the forest industry is not important. We're saying this tiny percentage of older native forests, we all need to be together on the same page to speak out for them, for the biodiversity and the beauty, and so we can all enjoy them. And thanks for listening to what I have to say, and I'm happy to take your questions and emails. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much for that great overview of old growth forest, just the ecology, as well as the work the organization has done. So again, for folks who are participating, we welcome you to enter your questions into the Q&A chat, and we will be happy to discuss those with Dr. Joan Maloof. To kind of get things started, I guess, since our focus here in the webinar series is on, policy in a broad sort of way. Are there opportunities or are there specific needs that you have been thinking about in terms of what policies could best support preservation of our old growth forests?
Thank you, Megan. Yes, a couple of them. One, Maryland State Forests, state parks, I'm sorry, Maryland State Parks are not protected from cutting. And most people are really surprised to hear that. They think, oh yeah, Maryland State Forests, okay, you can cut there, but our parks are protected, but they're not. I would love to see our state parks protected from logging, at least certain areas of them. If the parks are going to have a campground or a pool or something, maybe that would be outside the protected areas, but more protected areas in the park. The other thing I would love to see is, and some states do this, that when the harvest plan is applied for, that is accessible to the public, that harvest plan, and there's a little bit of lag time, maybe even just 2 weeks. And that way, if there is a forest that's going to be cut that's special, like the one that I showed you, that enables people to know and perhaps gives them an opportunity to approach the owners with some options. So for instance, if your neighbor had this beautiful old forest, and this has happened to somebody else, their neighbor had this beautiful old forest and they drove through this forest every day to get to their house and just loved this forest. Well, one day they came and that forest was completely cut down and they were just shocked. And they might have offered to even purchase that forest if they knew what was happening. So I feel like there needs to be a little bit of daylight in there. A lot of those harvest plans are just rubber stamped and turned right over. We could look at that.
Let's see, I know Gary had a question about whether you have had an opportunity to visit Beltwoods in Prince George's County.
Yes, and I'm familiar with the story of Beltwoods, and I was happy to see that become what's left of it, a wildlands area. So in Maryland, really the only forests that are protected from cutting are our wildlands. And as I said, the old growth forests that have been identified already that are in the state. We would have Beltwoods in the old growth forest network, but there's not really a parking area or good access yet, but it's a special old forest, yes.
Great, yeah, and an interesting question from one of our attendees who asks, there's so much attention being paid to eco-spirituality these days. To me, old growth is awe-inspiring, renewing, and promotes peace and stillness within. Can that angle be used to promote old growth in church communities?
Oh, yes. And in fact, we just added our first church forest to the old growth forest network. So if you are interested in the forests that we're adding, particularly in Maryland, if you go to our website, which is oldgrowthforest.net, and you just, put your details in there that you live in Maryland, and we send you invitations to all the forest dedications that we have in Maryland, and then we share announcements about the forests we add. So yes, the older forests are so special and they're healing. We're learning how much they do for us physically. They reduce our blood pressure, they reduce blood sugar, they improve immunity, they help with mental health. And I shared the story about going to the old growth forest near me and writing about it in the book. Well, in that chapter, that's called Old Growth Air, and I did the research for what is in the air that makes this forest feel so special and how healing it is. And I described the research done in Japan called Shinrin-yoku, the wood air bathing. And honestly, Megan, that is what started the whole revolution in the forest bathing in the US. Before that, I'd never heard of it. And then that article was reprinted, and now there's whole schools and you can be certified in forest bathing. So yes, the Blue Bike Trail forest would be perfect for a healing forest, they call them in Japan, or a wood air bathing forest.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, and one of my colleagues is certified to lead forest bathing
Oh.
exercises, and yeah, and we, as you said, we have some really wonderful forests here in Baltimore City, so we're excited to get more people out and enjoying those benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's also management challenges. So Dominic asks, can you comment on the decline I'm seeing over a 25-year period at most of our Maryland old growth, most of our Maryland old growth, with examples including Schoolhouse Woods, Beltwoods, Swallow Falls, etc.
So the decline, what particular decline is he seeing? Or what?
If you can clarify by adding comments in the Q&A field, that would be great. There may be some issues like for us, for example, in Baltimore City with some of our older forests, we certainly have, I would say, like a lack of regeneration due to deer overabundance.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but there may be other factors, whether it's
Yeah.
increased storm damage or
Right.
other factors that you
Yeah.
might be noticing.
Yeah, so the deer overpopulation is a challenge, and so I'm actually in favor of controlling deer populations for improved regeneration. Also, with climate change, we've had more extremes. We have had not only more droughts and longer, but then when we do have rainfall, it's a lot more intense and there's more of it. So all of these are challenges to the forest. So I would say basically that's not a reason to cut them because they're having challenges. I would say that's more of a reason to allow for more forests, to help make up for some that are going to be damaged in some of these intense storms.
Mm-hmm. And so within, say, like land managers who oversee forests that are part of the network, are there opportunities to connect with other network members and to kind of discuss some of these shared challenges? Is that something that's part of the network currently?
Not yet. I like that idea, and that's one of the reasons that we created our choices in forest management, because our forest managers of those network forests were asking us like, oh, what should I do? You know, what do you recommend? And our project is across the whole country, so there's a lot of different forest types, so it can be challenging. But we also wanted to promote the idea of wild forests. And this is something that was a report just came out last year from Harvard Forest. And they have a project called Woodlands and Wildlands. And their idea is they're trying to keep 70% of their land as woodlands, which would be the working woodlands too, and 10% wildlands. And those are lands that are pretty much unmanaged. So if they're going to fall over in a storm, they're going to fall over in a storm. You know, if invasives are going to come in, they're going to come in. If there's too many. So just the idea that it's okay in some places to do nothing. Now, not all places, but what he found was even though they're aiming for 10% wildlands, right now they only have 3%. So in our choices in forest management document, we discuss the wildlands option too, of doing nothing and how challenging that can be. If it's your job to manage a forest and to say, I'm just going to let some of these trees fall, it's new territory for a lot of people.
Yeah, and as you were saying with preservation of these lands in general, I think having those portions of a forest as a reference site or effectively a control, that might be an additional motivation for staying hands off with some of the areas.
Exactly, to help to understand it better. And also, as we're talking, I'm thinking of a case that happened in Connecticut, and this was a long time ago. Maybe it was the 1930s even. They had these two big old growth forests, and people said, oh, we should, save both of them. And a lot of people thought, no, we should use the timber from the one and cut that and get the income because we have the other one, Cathedral Woods. Well, they did cut the one forest, and the other one, Cathedral Woods, blew over in a tornado. So this is why we need some redundancy, because we know things can happen to the forest, and we need a little buffer. We need more than that, 0.01% on the shore, or point whatever the percentage was in the state. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. And Dominic did clarify, and I think based on his comments in the chat that the decline factors that we identified, I hope that we touched on. If you have follow-up questions, do feel free to add those in our last couple of minutes. So as we do just have 3 minutes left, want to be mindful of your time. If people would like to look at your sources, get involved with the Old Growth Forest Network, I assume that your website is a great place to start.
Yeah, I'm very happy with our website, oldgrowthforest.net, because you can look by state, and then within that state, see where the forests are in the Old Growth Forest Network. So if a forest is listed there, it means that it is protected from logging firmly. We make sure of that. And what we mean by that is commercial logging, certainly hazard trees can be taken out, things like that. It is open to the public, and it's relatively accessible. So we're looking for places that people can really experience, grandparents with grandchildren. We're not looking for the remotest little piece of wildlands. So we've had people plan trips across the country. I'm going to Indiana to visit relatives, wonder what forests I can visit there. And in addition to where all those forests are, there's 250 of them so far across the country in that category people can visit. We also have resources for education, like we're talking about the health benefits. We have fact sheets about that. We have fact sheets about carbon sequestration. We also, for foresters, if they want to consider part of their including old growth forest management in part of their management plans, we have some official documents for that the forester on our team made. So yes, please visit the website. And like I said, if you put your name and email address in there, when we have our dedication events in Maryland, we'll invite you.
Wonderful. Well, we just have about a minute left. So Gary, I will turn it back over to you to thank our wonderful guest and close things out.
Joan, certainly let me add my thanks to those of Megan for your passionate presentation and wonderful insights into forest preservation and protection. Obviously, the foundation strongly supports the protection of old growth. And so, in addition to posting a copy of this webinar on our website, I'd like to work with you and those that you're associated with on the staff of the network so that we can provide on our website a link from our website back to your website, so that in addition to simply seeing the webinar, they'll be able to punch a link and immediately transfer over to your website, because frankly, you've talked about a lot of issues that are of great interest to a broad number of participants in our work, and I'd like them to have access to the sources that you've outlined just briefly here at the very end of your presentation and your closing remarks, and those that are more elaborately described on your website. I think that is a very, very important one. For those of you who are watching our show today, let me remind you that the foundation presents these Framing the Future programs the third Thursday of every month. We're looking ahead to a very exciting fall with some very unique programs that are coming up about some equally, I might say, controversial subjects to some of the ones that Joan touched on today, about how to balance the kind of resource use of our natural resources and the protection, long-term protection of those things. But we're going to look at some of the other emerging threats out there, not merely for timbering, but frankly, for the emerging culture of data access and what it has impacted on the landscape. What we're really seeing is that tree cover is not exempt, not only from power lines, but from other data sources that are out there. And frankly, all of us talk about the cloud on the internet. Well, the cloud really isn't up in the sky, it's on the ground. And frankly, they want to put a lot of those resources in the areas where people don't live, and that tends to be where trees grow. So, we're going to be talking about that subject over the course of the fall in a couple of our webinars about an emerging land ethic in this area and also the controversies surrounding the installation of data centers, particularly in Maryland and the Washington metropolitan area around the nation's capital. Join us in the coming months for some of these topics. We look forward to having you with us. And remember to stay tuned for the educational opportunities that lie ahead, which we'll be talking about in other webinars in the near future. Again, I want to thank Joan and encourage all of you to take a look at the website she described for the Old Growth Network. We're very pleased to have Joan. She's a passionate advocate and a very visible support person for old growth networks across the country. We're very pleased to have had her today. Thank you very much, Megan, for helping to work out these details. I thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again the third Thursday of October at 1 o'clock. Peace to all of you.
Thank you.